The sepia-toned image shimmered with the ghost of a bygone era, its edges softly blurred by time, like a forgotten dream lingering just beyond memory. It was a photograph, dated meticulously to 1876, capturing the austere interior of what appeared to be a modest rural church. Sunlight, filtered through tall, unadorned windows, dappled the wooden pews, casting long, peaceful shadows across the worn floorboards. Every detail, from the slightly askew hymnal rack on the aisle chair to the intricate yet dusty patterns of a faded rug leading to the altar, whispered of a quiet reverence, a simple faith rooted deep in the heartland. At first glance, it was utterly beautifully ordinary. Another historical snapshot from a time when life moved at a different pace, preserved in an archive, waiting for no one in particular. This was not a grand cathedral, nor a renowned architectural marvel. No, this was likely a church in a small, forgotten community, perhaps nestled between rolling hills or carved out of a burgeoning prairie settlement, its name now lost to all but the most dedicated local historians. The photograph itself conveyed an almost palpable sense of stillness, a moment frozen forever, suggesting nothing more than a chronicle of daily life, a testament to the enduring presence of faith in simpler times. It was the kind of image one might idly flip past in an old family album, offering a fleeting glimpse into a world that felt both distant and curiously familiar. People saw it as a straightforward record, a dusty piece of paper that simply showed what a church looked like over 100 years ago, nothing more, nothing less. It seemed to hold no grand secrets, no hidden narratives, just the quiet dignity of a sacred space. Yet, as with many artifacts that bridge the chasm of time, there were faint, almost imperceptible nuances within the frame, nuances that hinted at something more, something beyond the immediate surface-level tranquility. If one looked closely, truly closely, beyond the general composition and the overall impression of peace, subtle anomalies began to emerge. There was a peculiar, almost unnatural sharpness to certain elements, while others remained stubbornly indistinct, as if defying the camera's lens. A sliver of light catching the edge of a pulpit seemed to gleam with an intensity that felt out of place, slightly too bright, almost like a deliberate highlight in an otherwise candid shot. Then there was the angle itself. It wasn't a standard centered perspective, but slightly off-kilter, as though the photographer had rushed or perhaps hesitated before clicking the shutter. A vague, almost imperceptible blur feathered the very bottom left corner of the frame, easily dismissed as a photographic imperfection of the era, yet persistent enough to niggle at the subconscious. These were not overt clues, but rather whispers around the edges of a conversation, easily ignored by a casual observer. The wooden grains of the pews themselves seemed to possess an unnatural rigidity in certain sections, contrasting with the fluid lines of the natural timber. A strange, elongated shadow, thin as a razor's edge, stretched from the base of the pulpit, falling across the steps leading up to it in a way that didn't quite align with the visible light source from the windows. It was too sharp, too defined for a shadow cast by diffused sunlight. The air in the photograph felt thick, heavy, despite the apparent brightness, as if the very atoms of the scene retained a secret weight. These fleeting glimpses, these minute discrepancies, were not enough to draw immediate alarm or even conscious attention for most viewers. They were merely quirks of an old photograph, the kind of flaws one expects from early photographic techniques. But they were there nonetheless, embedded in the very fabric of the image, waiting for an eye keen enough, patient enough, to truly see beyond the veil of the ordinary. They whispered of a story untold, a narrative patiently awaiting its rediscovery, hidden in plain sight within the quiet confines of an unassuming church, captured in a blink of the past. For those who find themselves drawn to the echoes of history, to the untold stories hidden beneath layers of dust and time, these faint irregularities serve as a silent invitation. They call to the curious soul, promising that sometimes the most profound mysteries are not found in ancient tombs or forgotten empires, but in the quiet corners of forgotten lives, in static images that seem at first glance to hold no secrets. This photograph, humble and unassuming, was about to reveal just such a secret, one etched into the very heart of its spiritual sanctuary. If you're fascinated by the whispers from the past, by the mysteries that history holds so close to its chest, then make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss how this seemingly ordinary picture unveils a tale far more complex and captivating than anyone could have ever imagined. The surface of history often conceals the most astonishing truths, and sometimes all it takes is a closer look to bring them into the light. The photograph, a silent sentinel of a forgotten era, might have remained just another dusty relic within the vast archives of the Regional Historical Society, had it not been for the meticulous work of Dr. Evelyn Reed. Evelyn, a sharp-eyed archivist with a penchant for uncovering the stories hidden between the lines of historical records, wasn't looking for anything extraordinary when she stumbled upon it. Her project that month was digitizing the entire collection of late 19th century church photographs from the dwindling rural communities of western Pennsylvania. Most were mundane, capturing brick facades or rows of stern-faced congregants, but this particular image, labeled simply Miller's Creek Church Interior, 1876, possessed a subtle, almost imperceptible pull. As she scanned the high-resolution negative, a process that automatically created a digital version, Evelyn found herself pausing. There was an unusual depth to the shadows, a certain weight in the air that even a two-dimensional image couldn't entirely suppress. It was, she mused, as if the camera had captured not just light, but a fragment of the atmosphere itself. Unlike many of the other images, which were simply faded prints, this was a perfectly preserved negative, allowing for an unprecedented level of detail once properly digitized. The initial scan, however, still presented the familiar muted tones and slight imperfections common to photography of the period. But Evelyn wasn't one to settle for an okay digitization. She believed every artifact deserved its full clarity. Taking the high-resolution digital file, she began her standard process of enhancement. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, applying algorithms designed to correct for historical photographic limitations, dust, scratches, fading, and the inherent blur often present in early exposures. She carefully adjusted the contrast, brightened the midtones, and sharpened the edges layer by painstaking layer. The goal wasn't to alter the image, but to strip away the accretions of time, revealing the photograph as it might have appeared to its original viewer. As the digital image slowly transformed, colors still absent but textures now emerging with startling clarity, Evelyn's focus instinctively gravitated towards the church's pulpit. It stood prominently at the front of the sanctuary, a dark, imposing structure of carved wood typical of the era. Initially, it seemed unremarkable, a solid block of religious authority. Yet, as the enhancement process deepened, particularly when she applied a specialized sharpening filter to the darkest areas, something peculiar began to manifest on its left flank. The grain of the wood, previously a uniform blur, now revealed a subtle unevenness. It wasn't the natural knot of timber or a flaw in the carpentry. Instead, etched almost imperceptibly into the dark varnish, were faint lines. They were thin, almost like hairline cracks, but their arrangement suggested purpose, not accident. They seemed to form a pattern, an intentional design. Evelyn leaned closer to her dual monitors, her breath catching slightly. This was precisely the kind of unexpected detail that made her work so endlessly fascinating. She isolated the section of the pulpit, zooming in until the pixels were almost individually discernible, then applied further selective enhancements. She played with inverted colors, adjusted luminosity curves, and even tried a subtle deconvolution technique to reverse the slight optical blur. Each adjustment brought a new facet to the emerging anomaly. The lines resolved themselves into shapes, angular and somewhat crude, yet undeniably deliberate. It was as if someone had taken a sharp implement and scratched directly into the wood itself, leaving a testament of their presence. The forms coalesced further, revealing what could only be described as rudimentary lettering. They weren't clearly legible yet, just ghost outlines beneath the layers of varnish and time. But they were there, etched into the pulpit, a place of sanctity, of pronouncements, of biblical verses and moral guidance. Why would someone carve into it? And what message could be so profound, so urgent that it necessitated defacing such a sacred object? A shiver of genuine curiosity, almost bordering on professional excitement, ran down Evelyn's spine. This wasn't merely a photograph of a church interior. It was a snapshot of a moment harboring a secret. The faint, almost invisible etchings posed a question across the chasm of history. What story did these marks tell? What hand had carved them, and under what circumstances? The initial glance at the ordinary 1876 photograph had been profoundly misleading. The deeper she delved, the more it became clear that this image held far more than simple architectural details. It held a whisper from the past, an almost forgotten voice struggling to be heard. The pulpit, once seen as merely part of the furniture, had become the focal point of an unfolding historical enigma. Evelyn knew with absolute certainty that her quiet days of digitizing mundane church records had just taken an unexpected and thrilling turn. The true work, the deciphering, was just beginning. The digital enhancements had brought forth the faint indications of inscriptions, yet the real challenge lay ahead, deciphering those elusive etchings. Dr. Eris Thorne, the meticulous archivist who had unearthed the photograph, knew this was where the true detective work began. He enlisted the help of colleagues with expertise in historical linguistics and aged script analysis. Their initial approach involved a battery of digital filtering techniques, attempting to isolate the subtle grooves from the wood grain and ambient shadow. They applied various contrast adjustments, experimented with infrared and ultraviolet simulations, even though it was a black and white image, hoping to reveal any hidden pigments or distinct material properties of the carved lines. Each pass yielded slightly different results, a tantalizing jumble of shapes that sometimes coalesced into fragments of letters, only to dissolve back into ambiguity with the next adjustment. Early attempts at reading were frustrating. One expert posited a series of Latin phrases, citing the church's likely denominational roots. Another saw what appeared to be fragmented lines of a hymn, the kind common in Protestant services of the mid-19th century. Yet another suggested it might be Old English, a relic of an earlier settlement period, which seemed unlikely given the church's established construction date. The phrases they extracted were confusing, almost nonsensical when strung together. Shadow, whispers, cold earth, burning light, forgotten prayer. There was no clear narrative, nothing cohesive. It was like trying to complete a puzzle with half the pieces missing and the other half from a different box entirely. The suspense in the archive office grew palpable with each new contradictory theory. Thorne meticulously logged every hypothesis, every digital variant, creating a matrix of possibilities, but clarity remained stubbornly out of reach. To add context to the linguistic puzzle, Thorne immersed himself in the local history of the small, forgotten rural community where the church stood. The town, named Oak Haven, was once a modest but thriving agricultural hub established in the early 1800s. Its records, though sparse, painted a picture of a close-knit, God-fearing populace, largely untouched by the industrialization sweeping other parts of America. The church itself, built in 1865, was the spiritual and social nexus of Oak Haven. Thorne scoured local newspapers from the 1870s, Old Town Council minutes, and pioneer diaries from the Regional Historical Society. He found accounts of bountiful harvests, occasional outbreaks of common illnesses, and the usual small-town squabbles. But nothing jumped out as particularly unusual or dramatic, nothing that would warrant cryptic messages etched into the very heart of their sanctuary. The records were largely unremarkable, almost idyllic, which only deepened the mystery of the pulpit etchings. Why would someone defile, or rather dedicate, the sacred space with such obscure words? As the linguistic analysis continued to yield fragmented and confusing results, Thorne began to formulate his own theories, blending the digital evidence with the historical context. Could it be a form of secret communication among a clandestine group within the church? Perhaps a radical offshoot of a mainstream denomination, expressing dissent in a way that wouldn't be immediately understood by the general congregation? Or was it a form of personal confession? A tormented soul etching their sins or fears into the wood, hoping for divine absolution through the very act of inscription? He considered the possibility of it being a collective message, a warning from the church elders about an impending crisis that they dared not speak aloud. The more he delved, the more the theories multiplied, each one more intriguing than the last. He imagined a lone figure, perhaps a pastor or a deeply troubled parishioner, working under the cover of night, driven by an urgent, ineffable compulsion to leave a permanent mark, a silent cry echoing across generations. The sheer effort involved in carving into hard wood with rudimentary tools suggested not a whim but a profound, desperate intention. The etchings, though still largely illegible, had already begun to suggest a weightier meaning than mere decorative scripture. This was not a sermon, it was a testament. The relentless pursuit of clarity, a grueling process of digital reconstruction and historical cross-referencing, finally yielded its reward. Thorne had spent countless hours with specialized spectral imaging software, painstakingly adjusting wavelengths, enhancing contrasts, and filtering out the pervasive noise introduced by time and photographic degradation. His screen, a kaleidoscope of false colors and abstract patterns, occasionally resolved into partial letters, tantalizing fragments of meaning. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, as a particularly aggressive algorithm processed an area near the base of the pulpit, a contiguous string of characters suddenly snapped into sharp focus. The words, though still grainy, were unmistakably clear. The wellspring cries blood. Thorne froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The air in his small office seemed to thicken, charged with an unexpected gravity. This was no biblical verse, no pious dedication. This was something far more visceral, more unsettling. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes scanning the surrounding etchings, now suddenly appearing less like random scratches and more like components of a deliberate, terrifying narrative. He adjusted the filters again, and another phrase emerged, slightly above the first, albeit fading at its edges: silenced voices. And just below the initial revelation, barely visible but distinctly there, beneath the stone. The cumulative impact of these phrases was profound. They spoke of violation, of suffering, of a dark secret buried not just in the wood of the pulpit, but seemingly in the very earth beneath the church. The innocuous initial appearance of the 1876 photograph had completely dissolved, replaced by a chilling premonition of hidden horrors. This breakthrough immediately shifted the entire trajectory of Thorne's research. The previous theories about secret societies or personal confessions now seemed almost quaint in comparison to the stark, haunting message before him. The wellspring cries blood was not ambiguous. It was a declaration, a lament, possibly even a curse. And the mention of silenced voices and beneath the stone suggested a specific, tragic event, an act of profound injustice that someone had felt compelled to memorialize in the most enduring way they knew how. Thorne felt a prickle of unease, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. This was no longer just an academic exercise, it was an archaeological dig into a community's forgotten trauma. His mind raced, desperately searching through the Oak Haven archives for any local legends, any whispers of a dark past that might explain these chilling words. The records he had previously dismissed as unremarkable suddenly felt incomplete, suspiciously sterile. How could a community described as idyllic harbor such a stark, violent secret? He remembered a brief, almost dismissible mention in an elderly resident's transcribed oral history collected in the 1960s about an old superstition. The resident, a Mrs. Elara Vance, had vaguely alluded to the Weeping Well, a local spring that was supposedly cursed after something terrible happened there long ago. Most historians had dismissed it as folk nonsense, a relic of pre-industrial fears, but now the wellspring cry's blood resonated with startling clarity. Could the Weeping Well and the wellspring be one and the same? Thorne dug deeper into the oral histories, cross-referencing names and dates. Mrs. Vance had also spoken of a time of great sorrow, specifically mentioning a small group of families who had vanished from Oakhaven in the late 1860s, just a few years before the photograph was taken. The official explanation had been that they moved west for opportunities, a common enough occurrence in the era. But Mrs. Vance had added in a hushed tone recorded on the grainy tape, "But no one ever saw them leave, and their fields lay fallow long before they would have reached Kansas." This account, previously filed under local eccentricities, now took on a sinister resonance. Silenced voices. Beneath the stone. The pieces were starting to fit, forming a mosaic of a different kind of history, one carefully suppressed. The growing unease was palpable. Thorne, usually detached and analytical, felt a shiver trace its way down his spine. The words etched into the pulpit were not merely historical data. They were a cry from the past, a desperate attempt to ensure that a terrible truth would not be entirely forgotten. The weight of this realization pressed down on him. He was no longer just enhancing an old photograph. He was becoming the accidental confidant of a century-old secret, a silent witness to a historical injustice. The phrases spoke of violence, of hidden deaths, of a profound cover-up that had permeated the very fabric of Oakhaven. What kind of secret could compel an individual to carve such a perilous message into the heart of their sacred space, risking detection and condemnation? The sheer audacity and the profound need for truth felt almost overwhelming. This was not a random act. It was a testament, a warning, and perhaps a plea for remembrance written in wood. The seemingly peaceful image of the 1876 church interior had now become a dark canvas, upon which the shadows of Oakhaven's true history were beginning to emerge, etched not just on the pulpit, but into Thorne's very consciousness. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had merely scratched the surface of a deeply unsettling story, one that demanded to be fully unearthed. The fragmented words on the pulpit, those haunting echoes of shadow, whispers, cold earth, burning light, and forgotten prayer continued to gnaw at Thorne. Their persistent resistance to forming a coherent narrative only amplified his determination. He realized that a purely linguistic approach, divorced from the human element, would never unlock their true meaning. The digital enhancements had reached their limit. Now it was time to step away from the screen and delve deeper into the tangible remnants of Oakhaven's past. His investigation had to expand beyond the photograph itself, venturing into the personal lives and experiences of those who walked the dusty paths of that little town in 1876. He needed voices, not just words. Thorne shifted his focus to the human archives, personal letters, family Bibles, local government records, anything that might harbor a direct connection to the Oakhaven church members during that specific time. The Regional Historical Society, a treasure trove of forgotten lives, became his primary hunting ground once more. He spent weeks poring over brittle documents, his fingertips tracing the faded ink of generations past, searching for any mention, however fleeting, of unusual occurrences, disquiet, or personal struggles within the community. He was looking for a crack in the idyllic facade Oakhaven's official records presented. Most of the findings were mundane: birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, and obituaries. Each document, while not directly illuminating the pulpit mystery, slowly built a more nuanced picture of the town's social fabric, its interconnected families, and its deeply ingrained piety. It was during one particularly dusty afternoon, sifting through a miscellaneous box labeled Donations Oakhaven, various dates, that he found it. Tucked beneath a stack of turn-of-the-century farming almanacs was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, its clasp long since broken, and the pages within were yellowed and fragile. The inscription on the first page, written in a surprisingly elegant looping hand, simply read, "The Daily Reflections of Pastor Elias Vance, Oakhaven Church, 1874-1877. Thorne's heart quickened. This was precisely the kind of primary source he had been desperately seeking. A contemporary account from the very heart of the church, spanning the critical year of 1876. He handled the journal with extreme care, scanning the first few entries. They were exactly what one might expect from a rural pastor: sermon notes, observations on the weather, laments about sparse attendance during planting season, and prayers for bountiful harvests. It was ordinary, comforting even to read such familiar sentiments from a bygone era. But as Thorne delved deeper into the entries for 1876, a subtle shift in tone began to emerge. The pastoral reflections grew less sanguine, more introspective, tinged with an increasing sense of anxiety. Pastor Vance began to speak not just of the congregation's spiritual health, but of a growing unrest, a shadow creeping into the community's collective spirit. These journal entries, initially disjointed and veiled, began to echo the cryptic nature of the words etched on the pulpit. Vance wrote of whispers that turn men's hearts cold, of a spiritual cold earth gripping the souls of his flock, and of the struggle to bring burning light back into their lives. He often mentioned forgotten prayer, not just as a lapse in devotion, but as something actively suppressed or lost. The parallels were undeniably striking, almost chilling. It was as if Pastor Vance's personal anxieties, recorded in the privacy of his journal, were being publicly manifested, albeit in a highly compressed and encoded form, on the pulpit itself. The entries suggested not a random collection of words, but fragments of a deeply personal and communal struggle. A recurring theme in Vance's later entries for 1876 was a veiled conflict, a discordant note, emanating from within the church deacons, specifically mentioning a certain elder's stubborn pride that was poisoning the well of faith. He didn't elaborate, never naming individuals directly, seemingly out of a desire to protect the privacy of his flock even from his own journal. But the undertone was clear. A profound and unsettling secret was festering within the Oakhaven church community. Vance lamented the weight of unspoken burdens and prayed for courage to face the darkening truth. The journal entries built a narrative of escalating internal strife, a hidden moral or ethical quandary that was slowly tearing at the fabric of Oakhaven. It wasn't a sudden dramatic event, but a slow, insidious erosion of trust and piety, culminating in a palpable sense of dread that permeated the pastor's private writings. The etchings on the pulpit were no longer random phrases. They were becoming contextualized, imbued with the weight of Pastor Vance's increasing despair and the unspoken tensions he so carefully alluded to in his journal. The true nature of the message, Thorne now understood, lay not just in the words themselves, but in the story hiding behind them. A story that Pastor Vance was desperately trying to tell, both through his diary and perhaps through the very wood of his pulpit. The hidden truth was beginning to reveal itself as a deep-seated conflict, a secret that had been carefully shielded from the outside world, yet one that had left its indelible mark on the spiritual heart of Oakhaven. The disparate fragments of words painstakingly extracted from the pulpit, coupled with the seemingly innocent historical records of Oakhaven, formed a disquieting dissonance. Thorne felt a growing conviction that the idyllic veneer of this 1876 community concealed a profound crisis, a hidden turmoil that the engravings and the recently discovered journal entries were beginning to reveal. He had found a small, leather-bound diary, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous church documents at the Regional Historical Society, belonging to one Thomas Albright, the church's deacon, in 1876. Its brittle, yellowed pages held a trembling script that spoke of more than just church finances and Sunday sermons. Albright's entries, initially mundane, began to shift in tone around the autumn of 1875, gradually reflecting a growing undercurrent of fear and division within Oakhaven. The crisis, as Albright's journal painstakingly detailed, was not a natural disaster or a physical threat, but something far more insidious, a deep moral and spiritual decay quietly consuming the community from within. It began subtly with whispers of discontent regarding the new minister, Reverend Elias Thorne. The Reverend, a charismatic but austere figure who had arrived in Oakhaven in early 1875, had initially been embraced. However, his sermons grew increasingly dogmatic, focusing less on grace and more on sin, damnation, and the absolute purity demanded of the faithful. He preached relentlessly about unseen evils lurking in the hearts of men, about the insidious corruptions that would tempt even the most steadfast believer. Albright's journal entries from late 1875 into 1876 chronicled the unsettling transformation of Oakhaven. Trust began to erode. Neighbors, once supportive, eyed each other with suspicion. Accusations born of fear and fueled by the Reverend's fiery rhetoric started to surface. Small disagreements escalated into bitter feuds. The church, once a unifying force, became the epicenter of this turmoil, a crucible where fears were intensified and loyalties tested. Reverend Thorne began to hold special confessionals on weekday evenings, demanding parishioners reveal their deepest sins, not to him directly, but to the congregation anonymously, written on slips of paper and placed in a wooden box by the pulpit. The very pulpit whose words now spoke to J. Thorne across the centuries. The entries described how these anonymous confessions, read aloud by the Reverend, created an atmosphere of paranoia, with everyone wondering who had written what and about whom. The words etched into the pulpit: shadow, whispers, cold earth, burning light, forgotten prayer, now began to resonate with a chilling clarity against Albright's narrative of social unraveling and spiritual torment. Shadow reflected the creeping suspicion, whispers the anonymous accusations, in cold earth, a premonition of death or spiritual barrenness, and burning light, the oppressive, judgmental glare of the Reverend's sermons demanding a purity that felt impossible to attain. The role of the church, and specifically that pulpit, became central to this escalating crisis. It was from that very spot that Reverend Thorne delivered his sermons, instigating the confessional practice that tore the community apart. It was there that the anonymous accusations were read, and it was there, by the very wood, that the community's moral fabric began to fray. Albright's anguished writings described how the pulpit, meant to be a symbol of solace and divine guidance, transformed into a platform of judgment and fear. People stopped attending church, or attended out of dread rather than devotion. Children grew quiet, their parents anxious. The once vibrant Oakhaven was gripped by a collective dread. The person behind the etchings, Albright's journal strongly suggested, was none other than Deacon Albright himself. An entry dated April 12, 1876 read, "My hand trembles tonight. The words of the Reverend burn in my ears, yet my heart cries out against them. The truth is buried, silenced by fear. I must leave a mark, a testament to what is truly happening, lest it be forgotten entirely. A silent scream in the wood for those who come after." This entry was followed by several others detailing his clandestine visits to the empty church late at night, driven by a profound, almost desperate compulsion. He used a small, sharp carpentry tool — he was an amateur woodworker — to meticulously carve the words, his heart heavy with the secret he dared not speak aloud. He knew the Reverend's accusations were baseless, his methods cruel, Yet he was powerless to stop the rising tide of fear that had consumed his friends and neighbors. The urgency of his message, therefore, was not merely a lament, but a desperate warning. It was a cry against the destructive power of blind faith and unfounded fear, against the manipulation of spiritual authority for personal power, and against the tragic consequence of communal silence in the face of injustice. Albright, a man of quiet faith and deep integrity, sought to record the truth of Oakhaven's ordeal, not in an easily discoverable document that could be destroyed or dismissed, but etched into the very fabric of the church, a silent, enduring testament. His cryptic words were intended for future generations, a desperate plea to learn from their mistakes, to see beyond the superficial beauty of the institution, and recognize the hidden dangers that could corrupt even the most sacred spaces. The etchings were more than just carvings. They were the final defiant act of a man witnessing his world fall apart, leaving a coded message in the heart of the wreckage, hoping someone someday would understand. The pieces of Oakhaven's tragic puzzle finally clicked into place, forming a searing, complete image of betrayal, fear, and a community's quiet undoing. Researcher Dr. Eris Thorne felt a cold dread settle deep within him as the full implications of Deacon Albright's words, painstakingly chipped into the pulpit, resonated with the harrowing accounts in the journal. It wasn't just a crisis. It was a deliberate, malevolent manipulation orchestrated by Reverend Thorne, a dark predecessor sharing his own surname, no less. The shadow mentioned in the carvings, now understood in its chilling totality, was not merely a feeling of unease, but the pervasive influence of the Reverend's oppressive doctrines, casting doubt and suspicion upon every soul in Oakhaven. The whispers were the false accusations nurtured in the dark corners of confessionals, poisoning relationships and tearing families apart. The cold earth was the spiritual wasteland the Reverend had created, devoid of true connection, warmth, or human kindness, where empathy had been replaced by judgment. And the burning light, that most sinister of phrases, revealed itself as the unholy fire of zealotry that consumed the church, burning away genuine faith to leave only ashes of fear and obedience. Dr. Thorne felt a profound, almost visceral pang of sorrow. The truth laid bare in the photograph and journal transcended mere historical fact. It was a raw, human tragedy. He had spent months, perhaps years, poring over dusty documents, his work often clinical, detached. But this was different. This wasn't just a record of events. It was a scream echoing across the decades, a desperate plea from a man who saw his world crumble, unable to intervene. He felt an inexplicable heavy weight in his chest, as if the anguish of Deacon Albright, a man he had never met, had somehow transferred itself to him through the silent medium of faded ink and carved wood. He traced the lines of the etched words on his monitor, his fingers brushing the cold screen, feeling as though he could almost touch the rough, splintered edges of the pulpit, touch the very tears Albright must have shed in the lonely confines of that empty church. The emotional impact was overwhelming, a stark reminder that history wasn't just dates and names, but the very real lives, struggles, and heartbreaks of individuals caught in its relentless current. The unspoken story, so carefully guarded by Albright, had finally found its voice after more than a century. The etchings weren't just carvings. They were a powerful, silent testimony to a significant, yet painstakingly suppressed historical event within Oakhaven. The community hadn't merely suffered a natural disaster or an economic downturn, they had endured a spiritual famine, deliberately engineered. The Reverend, under the guise of religious fervor, had systematically isolated individuals, fostered paranoia, and ultimately decimated the very fabric of trust and community that held Oakhaven together. Albright's cryptic inscription became a symbol of resistance, an act of quiet defiance against a powerful, corrupt authority. It represented the human spirit's inherent need to speak truth, even when facing insurmountable odds, even if that truth could only be whispered onto wood in the dead of night. It was the desperate act of a man who cherished honesty more than his own safety, who feared the obliteration of truth more than physical reprisal. The legacy of these words, almost swallowed by time and obscurity, was now undeniably clear. They were more than just carvings. They embodied the unresolved feelings, the unseen sacrifices, and the profound suffering of Oakhaven's past. They were a monument to those who had been silenced, to the fear that had gripped an entire village, and to the quiet heroism of one deacon who refused to let the truth vanish completely. Each letter, each subtle cut into the oak, was a testament to the belief that even in the darkest times a spark of truth could persist, waiting patiently for someone to finally see it, to finally understand its desperate message. Deacon Albright's silent scream in the wood had been heard. It resonated not with vengeance, but with unwavering hope that future generations would possess the wisdom and courage to distinguish between genuine faith and dangerous fanaticism, to recognize the insidious nature of fear-mongering disguised as righteousness. The pulpit, once a symbol of twisted authority, now stood as a testament to the enduring power of truth, patiently waiting for its moment to emerge, to deliver its profound and tragic warning. The historical incident referenced by the pulpit words, now fully deciphered and understood, offered a complete, albeit tragic, picture of what transpired in Oakhaven. The community, once a beacon of quiet piety and mutual support, had been irrevocably scarred by the Reverend Thorne's fanatical crusade against perceived sin, fueled by his own internal demons and a rigid interpretation of faith. His relentless pursuit of a purity he defined led to the public shaming, ostracization, and eventual exile of several innocent families suspected of witchcraft or moral transgressions. The shadow was the pervasive fear he instilled, the whispers, the insidious gossip that replaced genuine communication. The cold earth, a metaphor for the spiritual barrenness and emotional desolation that gripped the remaining townsfolk, and the burning light, the destructive, consuming fire of his self-righteous judgment. Deacon Albright's journal entries, meticulously cross-referenced with local archives detailing property sales and sudden disappearances, painted a chillingly clear picture of a small community tearing itself apart from within. The pulpit, intended as a source of divine solace, became an instrument of collective delusion and sorrow. The Oakhaven Church, once a sanctuary, silently bore witness to the dismantling of its own flock, the lives disrupted, the reputations ruined, the families forced to abandon their homes. These were the true casualties, consequences of a fear-mongering narrative etched not just into wood but into the very soul of a town. This seemingly ordinary 1876 photograph, initially dismissed as a mere historical curiosity, had transformed into a profound historical artifact. It was no longer just a faded image of a country church. It was a silent, powerful testament, carrying a hidden message of warning and remembrance for over a century. The dusty film, the subtle nuances of light and shadow, the seemingly insignificant details, all coalesced into a narrative far richer and more poignant than anyone could have anticipated. The research process, spanning countless hours of digital enhancement, archival dives, and meticulous deciphering, had peeled back layers of time and neglect to reveal a story of human vulnerability, the dangers of unchecked zealotry, and the quiet courage of one man who chose to speak truth through the most enduring medium he could find, the very wood of the pulpit. The photograph became a portal, connecting the present with a past that demanded to be heard, transforming what was once static imagery into a living, breathing chronicle of injustice and resilience. It underscored the profound idea that history is not merely a collection of dates and names, but a tapestry woven with the threads of human experience, some bright, some dark, all waiting to be rediscovered and understood. The emotional conclusion for me, the researcher, was a deep sense of connection to Deacon Albright and the forgotten people of Oakhaven. It wasn't just an academic exercise, it became a personal journey through sorrow and empathy. The weight of Albright's despair, his quiet defiance, and his desperate hope for future understanding resonated profoundly. It highlighted the importance of looking beyond the superficial, reminding us that history often holds secrets waiting to be unearthed, not in grand declarations, but in the subtle textures of everyday objects, in the forgotten corners of old photographs. This was a story not of kings or empires, but of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, their voices silenced by fear, yet ultimately echoing across generations through the steadfast hand of a deacon who refused to let their truth be buried completely. The experience underscored the responsibility of historical inquiry to not just uncover facts, but to honor the human spirit embedded within those facts. It was a stark reminder that even in the most seemingly benign historical records, profound lessons about human nature, community, and courage lie in wait, ready to offer guidance and perspective to those willing to look closely enough. The past is not dead, it is merely sleeping, waiting for someone to awaken its lessons. This remarkable journey began with a simple black and white photograph, an unassuming snapshot from 1876. Yet it unraveled a compelling narrative of fear, faith, and quiet heroism. It taught us that even the most mundane artifacts can hold extraordinary secrets, that every crack and shadow might contain a whisper from the past, and that patience and meticulous investigation can breathe life back into forgotten stories. We hope this deep dive into Oakhaven's hidden history profoundly moved you, as it did us. What are your thoughts on Deacon Albright's courageous act? Have you ever encountered a historical mystery that defied its ordinary appearance? Share your insights and theories in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our community of history enthusiasts and ensure you don't miss out on our next captivating historical unraveling. And for another fascinating tale of hidden meanings in plain sight, click on the video now appearing on your screen. Thank you for watching. And as always, keep exploring the hidden narratives of our shared past.